What if you made your villain more interesting than your hero? That might be a good thing. Today we're exploring what makes an antagonist actually unforgettable. Not just evil, not just intimidating, but straddling that sweet gray line that makes your reader and your main character second guess themselves. Think about the stories that have stayed with you long after you finish them. I'm willing to bet that in many of those cases, it was the antagonist that left the deepest impression. Darth Vader, Cersei Lannister, Tom Riddle. These characters aren't just obstacles. They push protagonists past their limits, make them doubt themselves, are always one step ahead, or are stronger than the main character in some way, shape, or form. But their power can't just be given to them by the plot. They need backstory, they need fears. They need a past that underscores why they've become the antagonist, how they came into their power, and what logic or emotion is driving their actions. So how do we create antagonists with that kind of impact? Great antagonists are not villains in their own minds. They're the heroes of their own stories, with justified goals and beliefs that happen to be in opposition to your protagonist. The most compelling antagonist should have clear goals and motivations that directly conflict with your protagonist. These aren't random evil schemes. They're deeply rooted in the antagonist's backstory, worldview, and personal values. Oftentimes, they stem from an injustice that was done to them, but it needs to be a strong enough injustice that it makes their subsequent actions make sense. If they don't make sense, there should be a reason why. Like the guy in my city who ran over a bunch of people in his van trying to kill the woman who rejected him. His actions don't make sense with his perceived injustice, so clearly something else was wrong with him. Your antagonist should have relatable struggles that readers can understand even if they don't agree with them. They should be fighting for something recognizable like security, justice, belonging, love, power, legacy. They're just doing it through awful methods and extremes. Make even your darkest antagonist have a line that they won't cross or a value they won't compromise on. When your villain has limits, it humanizes them in a way that makes their choices more interesting and adds depth to their character. For example, the antagonist in my current fantasy work in progress is fine with sacrificing thousands of people, but refuses to kill any animals for a reason that's relevant in his backstory. Your antagonist should have agency and resourcefulness that keeps them almost always one step ahead of the protagonist and forces the protagonist to grow and adapt. They shouldn't be foiled by sudden convenient events or their own stupidity. If your antagonist can be replaced with a hurricane or a hungry bear, you don't have an antagonist. You have a plot device. Your villain is a person who can pivot, strategize, and use their resources. Let them do so. And lastly, their worldview should contrast the protagonist in some way. A lot of great narrative conflict comes from fundamental philosophical disagreements, not just personal grudges. You can have grudges, but it adds complexity if their broader perspectives aren't fully aligned. One of the most powerful techniques for making a strong antagonist is by making them a mirror or a shadow of your protagonist. This doesn't mean they need identical backgrounds, but they should share key traits or experiences that took them down different paths. Your antagonist often represents what your protagonist could become if they made different choices. For example, both characters might have experienced a similar trauma, but where your protagonist chose resilience and hope, your antagonist chose bitterness and revenge. Or perhaps they share the same goal, but drastically different methods of achieving it. In my fantasy novel, both the protagonist and the antagonist are trying to keep the world together in the face of an apocalypse, but their methods on doing so are completely different. This mirror creates tension because the conflict becomes not just external, but internal. Your protagonist is essentially fighting against a dark reflection of themselves. And if you go down this route, it's a fantastic way to introduce nuance, doubt, and morally gray actions within your protagonist, because they'll be able to understand why the antagonist is doing this, and then they'll second guess themselves, which is what your villain wants. An antagonist's voice and presence should be distinct and memorable. How do they speak? What phrases do they use? How do they carry themselves physically? Even if you're not writing scenes in their perspective, consider giving your antagonist verbal or physical traits that makes them instantly recognizable. I mean, they're the villain. They shouldn't be mistaken for some lowly henchman. When developing your antagonist's voice, ask yourself, how do they view the world? What metaphors would they use? What topics make them passionate or vulnerable? Their dialogue should reflect these elements consistently. Your antagonist must also be a worthy opponent, which means they need power that matches or exceeds your protagonist's ability. This power can be physical, intellectual, social, political, magical, whatever fits your story's world and genre. What matters is that it creates meaningful obstacles that force your protagonist to grow and adapt. Map your antagonist's power arc throughout the story. Where are they strongest? Where are they vulnerable? And similar to what I mentioned in the last video about protagonists, how does the antagonist's power evolve in response to the protagonist's actions? And sometimes true power isn't always obvious. Some of the most dangerous antagonists are those who can manipulate others from the shadows, who understand your protagonist's weaknesses or can exploit social systems to their advantage. This type of power can apply to any and all genres. So let's go back to what I talked about earlier about humanizing your villain. When readers can glimpse moments of their humanity, it adds dimension and makes them think, oh, This is a real person. Try to show your antagonist in moments of vulnerability or introspection, connection with others, demonstrating values or principles, or experiencing joy, grief, or other complex emotions. These moments can be brief, but they should reveal depths that complicate the reader's feelings about the character. You're not excusing their actions, but you're making them understandable. There's a big difference between the two. So let's talk about some antagonist tropes that often fall flat. These are what we're actively trying to avoid when implementing the techniques mentioned in this video. You don't want to write a character who's evil simply for evil's sake, with no deeper motivation or reason. Unless you're writing certain types of horror or fairy tales where archetypal evil serves a purpose, most antagonists need clearer motivations. You don't want to write an antagonist who exists solely to be defeated without contributing meaningfully to the story. Every antagonist, even minor ones, should have some sort of purpose and personality. You don't want an antagonist who has captured the hero and then proceeds to monologue their entire plan, which gives the protagonist time to escape. I've always hated this trope. It undermines their intelligence and agency, and it's an insult to the conflict, the narrative, and the protagonist. Don't let your antagonist appear or reveal themselves at the last minute near the end of your story without proper build-up or integration. This often feels cheap and unsatisfying, like they're just a shadow with no real impact. And you also don't want an antagonist whose beliefs or motivations are portrayed so simplistically that they don't present a real ideological challenge to the protagonist. Like, I hate the world because I was bullied as a child. Okay, but how? Why? For how long? What was the turning point that cemented this worldview? That said, sometimes these tropes can work if you're deliberate about using them. For example, a pure evil antagonist could be effective in certain horror or supernatural contexts, or when representing primal forces rather than human motivations. If you're going to use a trope, you should first understand why you want to use it, how it serves your story, and consider ways to subvert the trope so it doesn't read like a cliche. Some more common mistakes that I've typically seen in novels would be making them too reactive, similar to the last video with the protagonist. Your antagonist should be driving their own agenda, not just responding to your protagonist. Second, making them inconsistently powerful. If your antagonist is established as brilliant and dangerous, they shouldn't suddenly make stupid mistakes just to give your protagonist the advantage. Third, not giving them a personal connection to your protagonist or story's theme. The best antagonists are emotionally invested in the conflict, not just random obstacles. And this connection doesn't have to happen in the backstory. It can be established within the story itself. You should be able to tell your entire story from your antagonist's viewpoint and have it make sense as their version of a heroic journey, even if you or the readers don't agree with their methods. And finally, as I touched on earlier, introducing them too late. Your antagonist or their influence should be established early on to create tension and stakes from the beginning. Some of the strongest hero-villain dynamics involve a shared history. When these characters have a past, whether as family, friends, colleagues, rivals, whatever, their conflict carries emotional weight that pure opposition just lacks. Consider giving your characters a complicated history that adds layers to their present conflict. Maybe they were once close but betrayed each other. Maybe they studied under the same mentor but took different paths. Maybe they're family members but with different values and goals. If you're writing fantasy where one character is light and the other is darkness, what is the gray element that connects them? This history deepens your characters and creates opportunities for complex emotion. Hatred mingling with lingering affection. Respect alongside opposition. Disappointment rather than simple anger. These emotional complications make conflicts more impactful, rather than straight up good versus evil scenarios. Because that's been so overdone by this point, let's mix it up. Your antagonist should be as active in driving your plot as your protagonist. Their decisions, actions, and schemes should create the obstacles and conflicts that form your story's backbone. One useful exercise you can try is to outline your plot from your antagonist's perspective. What are they doing when they're off page? How are they responding to your protagonist's actions? What plans are they setting in motion? These scenes might not appear in the actual draft, but their after effects will. At each major plot point, ask yourself, how does my antagonist influence or cause this event? If the answer is unclear, you might need to strengthen their role in the story. When you're creating an antagonist, you want to move beyond the simple notions of villainy to craft a character who is complex, active, and emotionally resonant. The best antagonists challenge your main character not just physically, but philosophically and emotionally. They force your protagonist to question their beliefs, confront their fears, and grow beyond their limitations. Remember that in many ways, your antagonist defines your story. The specific obstacles, conflicts, and choices your protagonist faces all stem from the nature of their opposition. So having a well-crafted antagonist will drive your story and determine what kind of story you're telling. If you found this video helpful and want some more structured guidance, I've just released a writing workbook specifically for developing protagonists and antagonists. Click the link in the description below to buy it now. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Until the next chapter.